Imagine you are perfectly healthy. I mean, you feel great. But outside, the sky is turning black, the wind is howling, and a massive storm is about to hit.
Okay, setting a pretty dramatic scene here.
Right. So you have a perfectly good umbrella sitting right there by the door. But you refuse to pick it up. You just leave it there.
Well, why would I do that?
Because you are terrified that if you walk outside holding that umbrella, your neighbors who are looking out their windows will assume you are deathly ill.
Wait, what?
Yeah, so instead of protecting yourself, you just walk out into the pouring rain and let yourself get completely soaked. You risk pneumonia just to prove to everyone how robust and healthy you are.
I mean, when you frame it like that, it sounds like absolute madness. You're actively choosing to harm yourself.
You are perfectly healthy.
Solely to manage the
great,
perceptions of the
but
people watching you
outside,
from their living
the
rooms.
sky is
It
turning
is
black,
absolute madness,
the wind
but that's
is
deeply
howling,
irrational
and a massive
fear.
storm
That
is about to hit.
exact
umbrella
setting a
scenario is
pretty dramatic
precisely what is
scene here.
threatening
Right.
the foundation
So
of the
you have
global
a
banking
perfectly
system
good
right now.
umbrella
It really
sitting
is.
right there
Welcome
by the
to the
door.
deep dive.
But you
Today,
refuse to
our
pick it
mission
up.
is to
You just
explore
leave it
this
there.
fascinating,
Why would I do that?
highly detailed
Because you are
paper
terrified
published in
that
the
if you
Global
walk
Review
outside
by
holding that
Fareed
umbrella,
Novin.
your
Yeah, it's a
neighbors who are
fantastic
looking
piece of
out their
research.
windows
It
will
is,
assume
and we
you
are
are
going to
deathly
unpack
ill.
why the ultimate
Wait,
financial
what?
safety
Yeah,
net,
so instead of
which is the
protecting
Federal
yourself, you
Reserve's
just walk out into
discount
the pouring
window,
rain
is
and let
fundamentally
yourself
broken
get
in the
completely
smartphone
soaked.
era.
You risk
And more
pneumonia
importantly, we're going to look
just
at
to prove
why
to everyone how
this
robust and
obscure
healthy
piece
you
of
are.
financial
I mean,
plumbing
when you frame it like
actually
that, it
matters
sounds
to
like
you. Like
absolute
your wallet,
madness.
your weekly
You're
grocery
actively
bill.
choosing to
Exactly.
harm
Because
yourself.
we are looking at a century-old
solely
mechanism
to
here.
manage the
It was originally
perceptions of the
designed to
people
give
watching you from their
fundamentally
living
healthy
rooms.
banks a place
It
to get
is
emergency
absolute
cash.
madness,
Right.
but
But
that
today,
deeply
as Novin's
irrational
paper
fear,
outlines so
that
clearly,
exact umbrella
that mechanism
scenario
is
is
caught in a
precisely what
brutal
is
storm
threatening
of
the
its own.
foundation of the global
It's
banking
being
system
battered
right
by
now.
persistent
really is.
inflation,
Welcome to the
lightning
deep
fast
dive.
digital payment systems,
Today, our mission
and a
is to
highly
explore
toxic
this
psychological
fascinating,
phenomenon known in the
highly
banking
detailed
world
paper
simply as
published in the
stigma.
Global Review
Okay, let's unpack
by
this.
Fareed
Because for the
Novin.
average
Yeah,
person,
it's
the
a
term
fantastic
discount
piece of
window
research.
sounds
It
like,
is, and we are
I
going
don't
to
know, the
unpack
drive-through
why
at
the
a fast
ultimate
food
financial
joint or a
safety
bargain
net,
bin at
which
a
is the
department
Federal
store.
Reserve's
Right, yeah.
discount window,
Not exactly
is
a terrifying
fundamentally broken
concept.
in the smartphone era.
Exactly.
And more
But in
importantly, we're going to
reality,
look at
it's more like
why
going to the
this
principal's
obscure
office.
piece of
It is
financial
supposed to be
plumbing
this helpful
actually matters
open-door
to you,
resource
like
for
your
the students,
wallet, your weekly
but
grocery
nobody
bill.
wants to be seen
Exactly.
walking
Because
through
we
that
are looking
door.
at
That
a
is a
century-old
perfect way to
mechanism
describe
here.
it.
It was originally
To
designed to give
understand why the
fundamentally
system
healthy
is failing
banks a
so
place to get emergency
spectacularly
cash.
today,
Right.
But today,
we have to look at
as
what it was
Novin's
supposed to
paper
do in the
outlines
first
so
place.
clearly,
Right, the original engineering.
that mechanism
Exactly.
is caught
And how
in a
human
brutal storm
psychology
of its
just
own.
completely
It's
derailed
being
it.
battered by
The origins
persistent
actually go back
inflation,
to the panic of
lightning fast
1907.
digital payment
way
systems,
back.
and
Yeah.
a highly
Before
toxic
the Federal
psychological
Reserve even
phenomenon
existed,
known in the
the
banking
U.S.
world
banking system
simply
relied
as
on
stigma.
wealthy private
Okay, let's unpack
financiers.
this.
Right.
Because for the
People
average
like
person, the
JP
term
Morgan,
discount
who would
window
literally
sounds like,
personally
I
step
don't know,
in,
the drive-through
lock
at a
bankers in
fast
a
food
room,
joint or a
and
bargain
force them
bin
to
at a
stop a
department
panic.
store.
That
Right,
sounds
yeah.
insane by
Not
modern
exactly a
standards.
terrifying
It was.
concept. Relying on one
Exactly.
billionaire's move
But in
just wasn't a
reality, it's
sustainable
more like
national
going to the
strategy.
principal's office.
So the Fed was
It is
created in
supposed to be this
1913,
helpful
and this
open-door
discount
resource
window
for the
was its
students,
operational
but
heart.
nobody wants to be
Okay.
It
seen
was built
walking
on a
through that
very
door.
specific
That is a
principle
perfect way to
articulated
describe
by
it.
a 19th
To
century
understand
British
why the system
economist
is failing
named
so
Walter
spectacularly
Bagehot.
today,
Bagehot's famous
we have to
rule.
look at what it
I
was
know it
supposed to
gets
do in the
quoted
first
constantly
place.
in
Right, the
financial
original
circles.
engineering.
It does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how human
He
psychology
argued
just
that to stop a
completely
financial
derailed it.
panic, central
The
banks must do
origins
three
actually go back
things.
to the panic of
Lend
1907.
freely
Oh,
at a
way
penalty
back.
rate.
Yeah.
Against
Before the
good
Federal
collateral.
Reserve even
Lend free,
existed,
penalty
the
rate,
U.S.
good
banking
collateral.
system
Got it.
relied on
Right.
wealthy
The
private
entire logic of
financiers.
this was psychological.
People like J.P.
Banking
Morgan,
relies
who would literally
entirely on
personally
confidence.
step in,
Banks
lock
take your
bankers in a
short-term
room,
deposits
and force them to
the
stop
cash
a
you might
panic.
want
That
tomorrow,
sounds insane
and
by
turn them
modern
into long-term
standards.
loans.
It was.
Like a 30-year
Relying on one
mortgage for your
billionaire's
neighbor?
move just wasn't
Exactly.
a sustainable
Because of
national
that
strategy.
structure.
So the
Even
Fed
a
was
perfectly
created in
healthy,
1913,
fully solvent
and this
bank
discount
can
window
collapse
was its
if all its
operational
depositors
heart.
get scared
Okay.
It was
and demand
built
their
on a
cash
very
back on the
specific
exact same
principle,
afternoon.
articulated by
because
a
the money
19th
is tied up
century
in the
British
house.
Exactly.
economist
So the
named
discount
Walter
window
Bagehot.
was meant to
Bagehot's
neutralize
famous
that
rule.
fear.
I
If
know it
everyone
gets
knows the
quoted
bank can just
constantly in
walk up to the
financial
Fed,
circles.
hand over some
It
good
does.
collateral, and
Yeah.
get cash on demand, he argued
Nobody
that to
panics.
stop a financial
So it
panic,
functions as an
central banks must
emergency
do three
release valve?
things.
Precisely.
But
Lend
somehow,
freely
over the
at a
decades,
penalty
the
rate
valve itself
against
became
good
the
collateral.
thing everyone
Lend
is
free,
terrified to
penalty
touch.
rate, good
Yeah.
collateral.
And the
Got it.
paper dives deep
The
into
entire
the math
logic
and
of
the
this was
psychology behind
psychological.
this, introducing
Banking
a
relies
concept called
entirely entirely on
Bayesian game
confidence.
theory.
This is
Banks
where it
take
gets
your
really
short-term
interesting.
deposits,
And I'll be honest,
the cash
when
you
I
might
read
want
the word
tomorrow,
Bayesian,
and turn them
my
into
eyes
long-term
usually
loans.
glaze
Like a
over.
30-year
I mean,
mortgage
what
for
does
your
an
neighbor?
18th century
Exactly.
mathematician have
Because
to
of
do with
that
modern
structure,
banking panics?
even a perfectly healthy,
it's
fully
the
solvent
absolute
bank
core of
can
the stigma
collapse
problem.
if all its depositors
Think about
get
modern
scared
banking
and demand
as a
their
game
cash
of
back
hidden
on the exact
cards.
same
Okay.
afternoon. There is a
Right, because the
massive
money is tied up in
asymmetry
the
of
house.
information. Exactly. So the discount
people
window
on
was
the
meant to
outside,
neutralize that
so
fear.
depositors,
If everyone knows the
investors,
bank
other
can just
banks,
walk up to the
they
Fed, hand over
cannot
some
see
good
a
collateral,
bank's
and get cash on
true
demand, nobody
real-time
panics. banks'
So
internal
it functions
health.
as an
Because they don't know
emergency
what the
release
spreadsheet
valve?
looks
Precisely.
like today.
But
Right.
somehow,
So they have to
over the
operate
decades,
on
the valve itself
probabilistic
became the
inference.
thing
Yeah.
everyone is terrified
Bayesian
to
updating
touch.
is simply the act
And the
of
paper
constantly
dives
looking
deep
for
into the
clues
math
and
and the
adjusting
psychology
your
behind
beliefs
this,
based on new
introducing a
observable
concept called
actions.
Kind of like
Bayesian
playing
game
poker.
theory.
Like, I can't
This
see
is
your
where it gets
hand, but if
really
you
interesting.
suddenly
And
start
I'll be honest,
sweating and
when I
pushing all
read
your
the word
chips in,
Bayesian, my brain
eyes usually
updates the
glaze
probability
over.
that you're
I
bluffing.
mean, what does an
That is the
18th
perfect
century
way to look at it.
mathematician
I'm
have
using
to
your
do with
behavior
modern
as a
banking
clue
panics?
to your hidden reality.
Well, it's the absolute core
And
of the stigma
over
problem.
time, the act
Think
of a
about
bank
modern
going to the
banking
Federal Reserve
as
to
a
borrow
game
money
of hidden cards.
stopped being
Okay.
seen as
There is a
routine,
massive
everyday liquidity
asymmetry of
management.
information.
The market started updating its
People
probabilities.
on the outside,
It became
so
what
depositors,
game
investors,
theorists
other
call
banks,
a separating
they cannot
equilibrium.
see a
Wait,
bank's
break
true
that down for me. What is a
real-time
separating
internal
equilibrium
health.
in
Because
this
they don't know what the
context?
So a
spreadsheet looks
separating
like today.
equilibrium
Right.
happens
So they
when
have to
different
operate
players in a
on
game start
probabilistic
behaving
inference.
differently
Yeah.
based on their hidden
Bayesian
traits.
updating is
Okay.
simply the act
In
of
this case,
constantly looking for
healthy
clues
institutions
and
and
adjusting your
distressed
beliefs based on
institutions
new
diverged.
observable actions.
Kind
Healthy
of like
banks
playing poker.
realized
Like,
that
I can't
going
see
to
your
the discount
hand, but if
window
you suddenly
brought
start
extra
sweating and
regulatory
pushing all your
scrutiny
chips
and
in,
potential
my
bad
brain
press.
updates the
Nobody wants
probability
that.
that
Right.
you're bluffing.
So they
That
started
is the
avoiding
perfect
the
way to
window
look at it.
entirely.
I'm using your
They
behavior
would
as
rather
a
borrow
clue
from
to
other
your
private
hidden
banks,
reality.
even if it cost a little
And
more.
Just to
over
avoid the
time,
spotlight.
The act of a bank going to the Federal
And
Reserve to borrow
because
money,
the healthy banks
stopped
completely
being seen as
abandoned the discount
routine,
window,
everyday liquidity
only the
management.
truly
The market
desperate
started
failing
updating its
banks were left
probabilities.
using it.
So
It
the market
became
learns
what
to read the
game
signal.
theorists
Yes.
call
They see a bank
separating
walking toward the Fed's
equilibrium.
door,
Wait, break that
and
down
they
for me.
instantly
What is a
update their
separating
Bayesian
equilibrium
beliefs. They
in
think,
this
oh, the healthy
context?
banks
So
don't
a
go in there
separating
anymore.
equilibrium
If this
happens
bank
when
is using the
different players
window,
in a
they must be
game
hiding
start
some
behaving
massive
differently
fatal
based on their hidden
problem.
traits.
You nailed
Okay.
it.
The umbrella
In this
actually
case,
does make you look sick
Healthy
because only the
institutions and
dying
distressed
people are carrying them.
institutions diverge.
The signal itself becomes
Healthy
inherently
banks realize
toxic.
that going to
And
the
Novan's
discount
analysis
window
points
brought
straight
extra
to
regulatory
real-world
scrutiny
examples from
and potential
2023,
bad press,
like the
Nobody wants
high-profile
that.
Right.
collapses
So
of
they
Silicon
started
Valley
avoiding
Bank
the window
or
entirely.
SVB and
They
Signature
would rather
Bank
borrow
Right,
from
I
other
remember
private
that.
banks,
These
even if it
multi-billion
cost a
dollar
little more.
institutions
Just to avoid the
literally
spotlight.
avoided
Exactly. And
preparing
because
for
the healthy
discount
banks
window
completely abandoned
because
the
they
discount
feared
window,
the reputational
only the truly
toxicity.
desperate failing banks
They didn't
were left
pre-position their
using it.
collateral
So the
with
market
the
learns
Fed.
to read
They
the
didn't do the
signal.
routine
Yes.
They
legal
see a bank
paperwork.
walking
I mean,
toward the
even
Fed's
preparing
door,
for the
and
window
they
in a boardroom
instantly
meeting
update their
was seen
Bayesian beliefs.
internally
They
as
think, oh, the
admitting
healthy
weakness to
banks don't go in
themselves
there
and their
anymore.
regulators.
If this
This is
bank
where
is
I
using the
struggle,
window,
honestly,
they must be
because the
hiding
cure
some
is
massive
actively perceived
fatal
to be worse
problem.
than
You
the
nailed it.
disease.
Yeah.
The
It's
umbrella
wild.
actually
If
does
a
make
bank
you
tries
look
to
sick
save
because
itself
only
by
the
using the
dying
government
people are
safety
carrying
net,
them.
the
The
market
signal itself
punishes
becomes
them by
inherently
immediately
toxic.
starting a run on the
And
bank.
Novan's
Pretty much.
analysis
That
points
is a
straight
tragic,
to
almost
real-world
Shakespearean
examples from
irony. I mean,
2023,
to avoid looking
like
weak,
the
banks do
high-profile
economically
collapses of
destructive
Silicon
things.
Valley Bank
Highly
or
disruptive.
SVB
The paper
and
notes, they
Signature
will
Bank.
sell off
Right, I
their
remember
long-term
that.
securities
These
at
multi-billion-dollar
massive, devastating
institutions
losses.
literally
Or they'll
avoided
borrow money
preparing
privately
for the
at
discount
punishingly
window
high interest
because they
rates.
feared
Anything
the
to stay away from
reputational
the Fed.
toxicity.
Right. They literally destroy
They
their
didn't
own balance
pre-position their
sheets
collateral
just to
with the
avoid the
Fed.
stigma.
They
They
didn't do
make
the routine
themselves
legal
fundamentally
paperwork.
weak
I mean,
just
even
to
preparing for
preserve
the
the
window
illusion
in a
of being
boardroom
strong.
meeting, it
was
was
seen
seen
entirely
internally
as self-defeating
self-defeating to
behavior.
themselves and their
Now,
regulators.
historically,
This is where I struggle, honestly,
bank
because the
could
cure is
maybe get
actively
away with
perceived to
playing
be
this game
worse
of
than the
chicken.
disease.
Sure,
Yeah,
because things
it's
move
wild.
slower.
If a bank tries to save
You could
itself
delay
by
that
using
trip
the
to the
government
discount window
safety
for a
net,
few
the
days,
market
try to
punishes
scrape together
them by
cash
immediately
privately,
starting a
and
run
just
on the
see
bank.
if the storm
Pretty much.
passed.
That is
Yeah.
a tragic,
But,
almost Shakespearean
as Novan
irony. I mean,
outlines in
to
stark
avoid looking
terms,
weak, banks
that
do
hesitation
economically
is no
destructive
longer
things.
just a risky
Highly
strategy.
The paper
Because
notes,
of
they will
modern
sell off
technology,
their long-term
hesitation
securities
is
at
a death
massive,
sentence.
devastating
Here's where it gets
losses.
really interesting, because we
Or
are not
they'll
talking
borrow
about
money
the panics of the
privately
19th
at
century anymore.
punishingly
No,
high
not at
interest
all.
We aren't
rates.
talking about
Anything
crowds
to
of
stay away
panicked
from the
people
Fed.
in top
Right,
hats
they
standing on
literally
the physical
destroy their
sidewalk
own balance
outside a brick
sheets
and mortar
just to
bank.
avoid the stigma.
We
They
are
make
talking about
themselves
the velocity
fundamentally
problem.
weak
The
just
digital
to
bank
preserve
run.
the
The
illusion
sheer
of being strong.
speed of modern
It is
financial
entirely
panic
self-defeating
has
behavior. completely outpaced
Now,
the operational
historically,
design of the emergency
A bank
systems.
could
During
maybe
that
get away with
2023
playing this
turmoil,
game of chicken.
SVB
Sure, because
faced
things move
attempted
slower.
withdrawals
Exactly.
equal
You could
to
delay
roughly
that trip to the
25%
discount
of its
window
total
for a few
deposits
days,
in
try
a
to
single
scrape
day.
together cash
Wait,
privately, and just
25%?
see if the storm
Yes.
passed.
Yeah.
Think about that
But
volume.
as
A
Novin
quarter of
outlines
the
in
entire
stark
institution
terms, that
trying to evaporate
hesitation
in a
is
matter
no
of
longer
hours.
just a
That
risky
is
strategy.
insane.
And these
Because of
modern
modern
runs,
technology,
they are coordinated
hesitation
on
is a
encrypted
death
venture
sentence.
capital
Here's
Slack
where it gets
channels,
really
on
interesting,
Twitter,
because we are
on
not
WhatsApp
talking about
groups.
the
You don't
panics
have to
of the
stand in the
19th century
rain. You
anymore.
just
No,
tap a
not at all.
screen.
We aren't
from your
talking about
living room
crowds
sofa
of
while
panicked
drinking
people
coffee.
in top
The
hats
money
standing
moves
on
at
the
the
physical
speed of
sidewalk
Wi-Fi.
outside a
Exactly the
brick-and-mortar
problem.
bank.
Melvin
We are
identifies
talking
this
about the
as
velocity
the speed gap.
problem.
The
I
digital
love that
bank
term
run.
from the paper.
The
It
sheer
really paints a
speed
picture. It's
of
like trying
modern
to stop a
financial
modern
panic
laser-guided
has
missile with a
completely
medieval
outpaced
drawbridge.
the operational
way to
design
put
of
it.
the
The
emergency
technology of the
systems.
panic has evolved into
During
the
that
smartphone
2023
era, but the
turmoil,
technology of the rescue
SVB
hasn't.
faced attempted
Verifying
withdrawals
collateral,
equal to
signing
roughly
complex legal
25% of its
agreements,
total
physically
deposits
routing the
in a
transferred
single
funds.
day.
Wait,
that plumbing takes
25%?
days.
Yes, it's heavily
Think about that
bureaucratic.
volume.
Oh, wait, I want to push back
A
here for a second.
quarter of the
Didn't
entire
the Fed
institution
see this coming and
trying
try
to
fix the
evaporate
tech?
in a matter of hours.
Because the
That
paper
is
mentions the
insane.
Fed
And
launched
these
a
modern
brand
runs,
new
they are
digital
coordinated
portal in
on
March
encrypted
2024
venture capital
called
Slack
Discount
channels,
Window
on
Direct.
Twitter, on WhatsApp groups.
If they build
You don't
a
have to
faster
stand in the
website,
rain. You
doesn't
just
that
tap a
close the
screen
speed
from your
gap?
living
A
room sofa
digital
while
portal
drinking
does
coffee.
absolutely
The money moves at the
nothing
speed
to
of
fix the
Wi-Fi.
psychological
Exactly
fear.
the problem.
Nor
No one
does it
identifies
fix the
this
legal
as the speed
unreadiness.
gap.
I love that
I see.
term
An
from the
online
paper.
portal
It really
cannot
paints a
instantly
picture. It's like
create the
trying to stop a
governance
modern
protocols
laser-guided
or
missile with
the
a medieval
institutional
drawbridge.
muscle memory
That's a great way to
a
put
bank
it.
needs
The
to act
technology
under
of the
extreme
panic has
pressure.
evolved into
Right.
the smartphone
You
era,
can't
but
just
the
click add to
technology of the
cart for
rescue
$10 billion
hasn't.
if your
Verifying
legal team hasn't
collateral,
spent
signing
months
complex legal
pre-positioning the
agreements,
collateral
physically
and
routing
clearing
the
all the
transferred
regulatory
funds.
hurdles.
That makes sense.
Plumbing
The
takes
problem Novin
days.
highlights
Yes,
isn't
it's
just
heavily
technological
bureaucratic.
modernization.
Oh, wait, I want to push
It
back
is
here
a
for a second.
temporal
Didn't the
transformation.
Fed see this
What do you mean by
coming
that?
and try to fix the
Well,
tech?
the Fed system was built
Because
to
the
be
paper
reactive
mentions the
over a
Fed
period of
launched a
days.
brand new
But the
digital
modern
portal
financial
in
system
March
requires an
2024
emergency
called
valve that is
Discount
continuously
Window
prepared to
Direct.
act in minutes.
If they built a
And if
faster
the bank's
website,
lawyers and
doesn't that
executives
close the
are
speed
too afraid
gap?
of the
A
stigma
digital
to
portal
do the
does
prep work during
absolutely
sunny
nothing
days,
to fix the
they have zero
psychological
chance
fear.
of figuring it out.
Nor
in the
does it
minute
fix
before
the legal
missile lands.
unreadiness.
Zero chance.
Which sounds
I
like a
see.
An
terrible
online portal
problem for
cannot
Wall Street
instantly create the
executives, right?
governance protocols
But the
or
paper takes this
the
a step
institutional
further.
muscle memory
This
a bank
technological and
needs to act
psychological
under extreme
failure in the
pressure.
banking
Right.
sector
You can't
is
just click add
actively
to cart for
colliding
$10
with the
billion
money in your
if your
pocket.
legal team
It
hasn't
is
spent
directly
months
tied to
pre-positioning the collateral
So,
and clearing all the
how
regulatory
does a bank's
hurdles.
fear of a
That makes sense.
website connect
The
to the
problem
price of a
Novin
gallon of
highlights
milk?
isn't just
That
technological
pulls us out of the
modernization.
micromechanics
It is a
of a
temporal
single
transformation
bank
and
What
into
do you
the
mean by
macro
that?
dilemma of
Well,
the
the
entire
Fed
global
system was
economy.
built to be
Okay, lay
reactive
it on
over
me.
a period
We
of
have
days.
to look at the post-2022
But the modern financial
environment.
system requires an
Following the
emergency
massive
valve
inflation
that is
shock of
continuously
2021
prepared to
through
act in minutes.
2023.
Central
And
banks
if the
across
bank's
the
lawyers
G7
and
had to slam
executives
on the
are
economic
too afraid of
brakes.
the stigma
They
to
raised
do the
interest
prep work
rates
during
significantly,
sunny days,
engaging in a
they have
process
zero
called
chance of
quantitative
figuring
tightening.
it out in
Just
the
to cool
minutes
down
before
the
missile
economy,
hits.
Zero
Make
chance.
borrowing more
Which sounds like a
expensive
terrible
and
problem
stop
for Wall
prices
Street
from skyrocketing.
executives, right?
Correct.
But the paper
raising
takes
interest
this a
rates
step further.
aggressively
This
creates a
technological and
massive structural
psychological
trap
failure
for
in the
banks.
banking sector
When interest
is
rates go up
actively
rapidly,
colliding with the money
the
in your
market
pocket.
value of
It is.
It is
older,
directly tied to
long-duration
inflation.
government bonds
So,
plummets.
how does
Hold
a
on,
bank's
explain the
fear of a
mechanics of that to me.
website
Explain
connect
it to me like
price
I'm
of a
5.
gallon of milk?
Why does the
That
Fed
pulls us out
raising
of the
interest rates
micromechanics
make
of
a
a single
bank's
bank run
old,
and
safe
into the
government
macro
bonds
dilemma of
lose
the entire
value?
global
Sure.
economy. Imagine
Okay,
a bank
lay it
bought a
on me.
10-year
We have to
government
look at the
bond back in
post-2022
2022
environment.
that pays a 2%
Following the
interest
massive
rate.
inflation shock
Okay.
of 2021
At the time, that was a
through
standard,
2023,
very
central
safe
banks
investment.
across the G7
But suddenly
had to slam on
inflation
the economic
spikes.
brakes.
The Fed
Right.
raises rates
They
to
raised
fight
interest
it,
rates
and now new
significantly,
government bonds are
engaging
being
in a
issued
process
to
called
pay a
quantitative
5%
tightening.
interest rate.
Just to
Oh, I
cool
see
down
where
the
this is going.
economy,
If that
make
bank suddenly
borrowing more
needs cash to
expensive,
pay off
and
fleeing
stop prices from
depositors, and they
skyrocketing.
try to sell their
Correct.
old 2%
But
bond on the
raising
open
interest
market,
rates aggressively
nobody's going to buy
creates
it.
a massive
why would an
structural
investor
trap
buy
for
an old
banks.
bond paying 2%
When interest
they
rates
can buy
go
a brand
up
new one
rapidly,
paying 5%?
Unless
market
the
value
bank
of
puts the
older,
2% bond on
long-duration
clearance.
government
Like they have
bonds
to sell it at a
plummets.
steep
Hold on,
discount to
explain the
make the
mechanics
math
of that
work
to me.
for the
Explain it
buyer.
to me like I'm
Yes.
5. Why does the
Exactly.
Fed
So
raising
because the
interest
Fed
rates
raised
make
rates
a
to fight
bank's
inflation,
old, safe
these
government
banks are
bonds
sitting on
lose value?
mountains of what
Sure.
we call Imagine a unrealized bank bought a losses. 10-year government
Unrealized
bond
losses.
back in as long as they don't have to 2020 sell those bonds, that pays a it's just a 2% paper interest
loss.
rate.
But if a
Okay.
digital
At the
bank
time, that
run
was a
starts,
standard, very
they are
safe
forced
investment.
to sell those
But
bonds
suddenly
at
inflation
a massive
spikes.
loss,
The Fed raises rates to
instantly
fight it,
destroying
and
the
now
bank's
new
solvency.
government bonds are being
Wow.
issued.
This makes the
that pay
entire
a
banking
5%
sector
interest rate.
structurally
Oh, I see where this is
fragile
going.
during
if that
periods of
bank suddenly
inflation
needs
fighting.
cash to
Let me
pay off
connect this
fleeing
directly to
depositors,
you, the listener,
and they try to
because
sell their old
this
2%
is the
bond
central
on the
tension
open
of the
market,
entire paper.
nobody's going to
The
buy
central
it. I mean,
bank is
why would
playing
an
a
investor buy
terrifying
an old
game of
bond
tug
paying
of war.
2%
They
when they
really
could
are.
buy a brand
On
new
one
one
end
paying
of the rope is your
5%?
Unless
grocery
the
bill,
bank
your
puts
rent,
the 2%
the cost
bond
of
on
living.
clearance.
To
Like they
pull
have to
those
sell
prices
it at a
down,
steep
the Fed
discount
has
to
to
make the
pull
math
hard
work
on
for the
interest interest rates.
Yes.
But on the other end of the rope are these fragile
so because
banks
the Fed
sitting on
raised rates to
discounted
fight
bonds.
inflation,
If the Fed
these
pulls
banks
too
are
hard, the
sitting
banks
on
start
mountains
snapping.
of what we
But
call
if a bank starts
unrealized
failing
losses.
and it's too terrified of the stigma
As long as they don't have to sell those
use the
bonds, it's
discount
just a
window,
paper loss.
it
But if a
collapses
digital
loudly in
bank
public
run
news.
starts, it's a disaster. They
If
are
the Fed
forced to
has to
sell those
rush in at the
bonds
last
at
minute
a
with a
massive
massive,
loss,
highly
instantly
visible
destroying the
emergency
bank's
bailout for
solvency.
depositors, well,
This makes
the
the
market
entire
gets
banking
confused.
sector structurally
They think
fragile
the Fed is
during
panicking.
periods of inflation
They think
fighting.
the Fed is
Let me
giving
connect this
up on
directly
fighting
to you,
inflation
listener, because
just
this is
to
the
save
central tension
Wall
of the
Street.
entire paper.
If we connect
The
this to
central
the bigger
bank is
picture,
playing a terrifying
financial
game
stability
of tug of war.
policy and
really
inflation control
On one end of the
are no
rope is
longer
your grocery
separate
bill,
domains.
your rent,
They are
the
the
cost of
exact
living.
same fight.
That
To
is
pull those prices
wild.
down,
If the
the
market
Fed has
believes
to
the
pull
Fed will
hard on
eventually have to
interest
drop
rates.
interest rates
But on the other
or
end of the
print
rope are these
massive
fragile
amounts of
banks
money
sitting
just
on
to rescue
discounted
failing
bonds.
banks,
If the Fed
inflation
pulls too hard, the
expectations
banks
become
start snapping.
unanchored.
Right.
But if a bank
public
starts
assumes
failing and
inflation
it's
is here
too
to stay,
terrified of the stigma
financial
to
conditions
quietly
loosen
use the
prematurely,
discount window,
and the central
it
bank
collapses
completely
loudly
loses
and
its credibility.
publicly.
And that's
So
a disaster.
functional,
If the Fed has to
stigma-free
rush in at
discount
the last
window
minute
is
with a
actually
massive,
essential.
Absolutely.
It gives the Fed the cover and the credibility it needs to keep interest rates high and keep fighting inflation. They think the Fed is panicking that if a bank hits a speed bump, giving up on fighting inflation
reliable shock
just
absorber
to
in
save
place.
the discount window isn't
If we
just about
connect
saving
this to the
banks.
bigger picture,
It's the armor the Fed
financial
wears to
stability
fight
policy
inflation
and
without
inflation
blowing up the
control
economy.
are no longer separate
Recognizing
domains.
this existential
They're the
threat to
exact
their
same
monetary
fight.
sovereignty,
wild.
lawmakers
If
can't
the
just sit
market
around and
believes
hope
the Fed
bankers
will
suddenly
eventually
get
have to
brave.
drop interest
They
rates
are trying
or print
to hack
massive
the game
amounts of
theory.
money
They really
just to
are.
rescue failing
Can they
banks,
legally force
inflation
banks to pick up the
expectations
umbrella?
become unanchored.
They are certainly trying.
The public assumes
the legislative
inflation is here
fix
to stay.
outlined in the paper
Financial
focuses
conditions
on
loosen
the
prematurely,
bipartisan
and the
discount
central
window
bank
preparedness
completely
act.
loses its
Which was
credibility.
introduced on
So
May
a
20,
functional,
2026.
stigma-free discount
Exactly.
window is
This
actually
bill
essential.
is a fascinating
It gives
attempt
the
at
Fed the cover
institutional
and the
signal
credibility it
engineering.
needs to keep
It
interest rates
mandates that
high and
banks
keep
with over
fighting
$100
inflation.
billion in assets
Knowing that
must
if a
actually
bank hits
test
a
their
speed
discount
bump,
window
there is a
access, moving
quiet,
money back and
reliable
forth
shock
on a
absorber
quarterly
in
basis.
place.
Okay.
The
And
discount
banks
window
between
isn't just
$10
about
billion
saving banks.
and $100 billion
It's the armor the
have
Fed
to
wears
test
to
it
fight inflation
semi-annually.
without
And it forces
blowing up
the
the economy.
regulators to
Yes.
change their
Recognizing
psychology,
this
too.
Yes, it
existential
does.
threat
Instead
to
of
their
scrutinizing
monetary
banks with
sovereignty,
suspicion when they prep
lawmakers
for the
can't just
window,
sit around and
the
hope
bill
bankers
legally
suddenly
requires
get brave.
regulators to
They
actively
are trying
reward
to
them for
hack
being
the game
prepared in their
theory.
annual
They really are.
reviews.
Which
Can
is
they
a
legally
required
force
cultural
banks
shift.
to pick up the umbrella?
Earlier, we
They are
discussed the
certainly trying.
separating
The
equilibrium,
legislative
right?
fix
where the healthy
outlined in the
banks
paper
avoid the window
focuses
and the
on
sick
the
banks use it.
bipartisan
Right.
discount
This
window preparedness
2026
act.
Which was
legislation is
introduced on
trying
May
to
20,
engineer the opposite.
2026.
Exactly.
Pooling
This
equilibrium.
bill is a
Pooling
fascinating
equilibrium.
attempt at
Okay.
institutional
The goal,
which is
signal
supported by
engineering.
prominent
It
former
mandates
financial
that
officials
banks
with over
people
$100
like
billion
Donald
in
Cohn, Sheila
assets
Bair, and
must
William
actually
Dudley
test their
is to
discount window
intentionally
access,
dilute
moving
the
money back
signal.
and forth
How does that
on a
work?
quarterly basis.
Well,
Well, and banks
if
between
every
$10
single
billion
bank is
and
forced to
$100
use the
billion
window
regularly
have to
by
test it
law,
semi-annually.
the market
And it
won't
forces the
know if a bank
regulators
is
to
just
change
doing
their
its mandatory
psychology, too.
Tuesday
Yes, it
test,
does.
or if it's
Instead of
actually
scrutinizing
quietly
banks with
bleeding to
suspicion
death.
when they prep for the window,
The observable
the bill
behavior of the
legally
healthy
requires
and the
regulators
sick
to actively
converges into
reward
one
them for being prepared in their
indistinguishable
annual
pool,
reviews.
It's the school fire
which
drill
is a
model.
required
If the alarm
cultural
goes off
shift.
randomly, people
Earlier,
panic.
we discussed the
But if
separating
the alarm goes off
equilibrium,
every single
right?
Tuesday
Where the healthy
at
banks
noon,
avoid the
nobody
window
blinks.
and the
You
sick
just
banks
grab
use
your
it.
coat,
Right.
walk outside,
This
and complain about the
2026
interruption.
legislation is
Precisely.
trying
The
to
sheer
engineer the
brilliance of this
opposite.
policy is that
A
you are
pooling
hiding the actual
equilibrium.
fires
Pooling
inside a
equilibrium.
rigid
Okay.
schedule
The
of
goal, which is
mandatory
supported by
drills.
prominent
But let me
former
push
financial
back on this
officials,
because it
people
sounds
like
almost
Donald
too
Cohn,
easy.
Sheila
Okay, go
Bair,
ahead.
and
If you
William
completely
Dudley,
wipe out
is
the
to
stigma and you
intentionally
make it
dilute the
incredibly
signal.
How does that
frictionless
work?
and normal for banks
Well,
to get
if
unlimited
every
emergency
single
cash
bank
from
is
the
forced
Fed,
to use the window
doesn't this
regularly
create
by
a
law,
massive
the
moral
market won't
hazard?
know if a
Oh, that's
bank
the
is
big
just doing
question.
its
Like if a
mandatory
bank
Tuesday
executive
test,
knows
or if
the
it's actually
government safety
quietly
net is
bleeding to death.
always
Oh.
there,
The observable
always
behavior
primed,
of
and
the
nobody
healthy
will
and the
judge them
sick
for using it,
converges into one
won't they just take
indistinguishable
wilder,
pool.
more
It's the school
irresponsible
fire drill
risks
model.
with our
Yes.
If the alarm goes off
The
randomly,
tension you
people
are
panic.
highlighting is
But
the
if the
exact
alarm goes off
debate
every single
currently
Tuesday at
dominating
noon,
international
nobody
finance.
blinks. You just
Like
grab
never.
your coat, walk
Novin's
outside,
paper
and
notes,
complain about the
this is
interruption.
high on the
Precisely.
agenda
The
for the
sheer
upcoming
brilliance of this
G7
policy is
Evian
that you are
Summit in
hiding the
France,
actual
which
fires
is scheduled for
inside a
June
rigid
15 to
schedule of
17,
mandatory
2026.
drills.
Very
Okay.
clever.
But let
The
me
French
push back on
presidency
this
of the
because it
G7
sounds
is
almost too
explicitly
easy.
focusing
Okay,
on
go
this
ahead.
intersection.
If you completely
They are
wipe out
looking
the
at how
stigma
rapid
and you make it
technological
incredibly
transformation,
frictionless
so things
and
like
normal
aggressive
for banks to get
cybersecurity threats,
unlimited
artificial
emergency cash from
intelligence
the
and
Fed,
trading, and
doesn't
instant
this
digital
create a
payments
massive
interacts with
moral
financial
hazard?
stability.
Oh, that's
Because
the
a
big
digital
question.
bank
If a
run
bank
sparked
executive
by an
knows the
AI-generated
government
rumor
safety
on
net is
social media
always
isn't
there,
just an American
always
problem,
primed,
Not
and
at all.
nobody will judge them
The
for using
G7
it,
leaders are
won't
waking
they
up
just
to the
take
reality that
wilder, more
maintaining price
irresponsible
stability for their
risks with our
citizens
deposits?
and preventing
The
digital
tension you
bank
are
runs
highlighting is
are
the exact
inherently linked
debate
globally,
currently
It's
dominating
all
international
connected.
Yes,
finance.
if central
never.
banks make liquidity too
Novin's
easy to
paper notes,
access,
this is
they might
high on the
accidentally
agenda for the
encourage
upcoming
reckless
G7
behavior and loosen
Evian
financial
Summit in
conditions,
France,
precisely
which is
especially when they're trying to tighten them to fight inflation. But if they allow the stigma to persist,
the French presidency
they
of the
risk
G7 is
disorderly,
explicitly focusing on
cascading
this
collapses
intersection.
that force them
They
to
are looking
abandon
at
their
how
inflation
rapid
fight anyway.
technological transformation,
Sovereign bond markets,
so things
complex
like
repo
aggressive
systems,
cybersecurity
cross-border
threats,
funding
artificial
vulnerabilities. I
intelligence
mean,
in
it is a
trading,
tightly
and
wound,
instant digital
interconnected
payments
web.
interacts with financial
Pulling on
stability.
one thread in
Because
New
a
York can
digital
unravel
bank
a
run
bank in
sparked by
London
an
or Paris.
AI-generated
We have
rumor
covered
on
some
social
incredible
media
ground
isn't
today.
just
We've
an
gone
American
from
problem.
Walter
Not at all.
Bagehot's 19th
The
century
G7
Victorian
leaders
safety
are
net
waking
to a
up to the
modern
reality
game
that
theory trap,
maintaining price
where the
stability for
sheer
their
fear of
citizens
looking weak
and preventing
actually
digital
causes
bank
banks to
runs
destroy their own balance
are
sheets.
inherently linked
quite a journey.
globally.
We've explored
It's
how a
all connected.
Yes,
smartphone can
if
drain
central
a quarter
banks
of a
make
bank's
liquidity
deposits
too
an
easy to
hour,
access,
vastly
they might
outpacing a
accidentally
rescue
encourage
system built
reckless
for a
behavior and
bygone
loosen
era.
financial
And we've
conditions
seen how that
precisely when they're
structural
trying to
failure
tighten them to
threatens
fight
to
inflation.
sabotage the global
But if they
fight
allow the
against
stigma to
inflation,
persist,
leading to
they
this
risk
massive
disorderly,
2026
cascading
legislative
collapses
push
that force them to
banks
abandon their
to
inflation fight
practice
anyway.
mandatory fire
Sovereign
drills.
bond markets,
This
complex
raises an
repo
important
systems,
question, though.
cross-border
What is the
funding
fundamental nature
vulnerabilities.
of
I mean,
the
it is a
discount
tightly
window in the
wound,
21st century?
interconnected
Right.
web.
Noven's
Pulling
conclusion
on one
is
thread in
striking.
New York can
The
unravel a
discount
bank in
window is
London
no
or
longer
Paris.
just a
We
mechanical
have covered
lending
some
facility.
incredible ground today.
It is
We've
the
gone from
informational
Walter
architecture of
Bagehot's
monetary
19th century
sovereignty
Victorian
itself.
That's a
safety
powerful
net to a
statement.
modern
In an
game
era
theory
of
trap
digital speed
where the
capital and
sheer
instant
fear of
algorithmic
looking
market
weak
reactions,
actually causes banks to
confidence
destroy
is
their
now the
own
most
balance
volatile,
sheets.
precious
Quite a journey.
asset in
We've
international
explored how a
finance.
smartphone can
If
drain a
central
quarter
bank
of a
cannot
bank's
manage the
deposits in
signals that
hours,
generate that
vastly
confidence, it
outpacing a
simply
rescue
cannot
system
manage the
built for a
economy.
bygone
So what does this
era.
all mean?
And
It
we've
means the
seen
hidden
how that
plumbing of our
structural
financial
failure
system
threatens
is
to
deeply
sabotage the
psychological,
global fight
and
against
right now the
inflation,
psychology is
leading to
fundamentally
this
broken.
massive
really is.
2026
But I want to leave
legislative
you with
push
a
to
final
force banks
provocative
to
thought
practice
drawn from the
mandatory
very
fire
end of
drills.
Noven's analysis.
This raises an
Something
important
we
question,
haven't even
though.
fully grappled
What
with
is the
yet.
fundamental
Oh,
nature
this
of
is
the
a big one.
discount window
Because
in the 21st
traditional
century?
banks are
Right.
so heavily
Noven's
constrained
conclusion
by
is
the
striking.
stigma in these new
The
regulations,
discount window is no longer
money
just a
is
mechanical
rapidly
lending
migrating
facility.
out of the traditional
It is
banking
the
system
informational
altogether.
architecture of
It
monetary
is moving into the
sovereignty
world of
itself.
shadow
That's a
banks,
powerful statement.
private
In
credit
an era
funds,
of
hedge
digital speed
funds,
capital and
massive
instant
fintech
algorithmic market
platforms.
reactions,
These
confidence
non-bank
is now the
financial
most volatile,
intermediaries are
precious
growing at a
asset in international
staggering rate.
finance.
And crucially,
If a central
they
bank cannot
engage in the
manage
exact
signals
same
that
kind
generate
of
that confidence,
maturity
it simply
transformation and
cannot manage the
risk-taking
economy.
that
So
traditional
what does
banks
this all
do,
mean?
taking
It means the
short-term
hidden
cash and
plumbing
tying
of
it
our
up in
financial
long-term
system is
investments.
deeply
But here's the
psychological,
terrifying part.
and right
These
now
shadow
the
banks have
psychology is
absolutely
fundamentally
no
broken.
access
It
to the
really
Fed's
is.
safety
But I
nets.
want to leave you
None.
with a
None at all.
final
They don't have a
provocative
discount
thought
window to
drawn
fall
from the
back
very
on, with
end of
or without
Noven's
stigma.
analysis.
So
Something we
if
haven't
the
even fully grappled with
highly
yet.
regulated
Oh, this
global
is a big
banking
one.
system
Because
is this
traditional banks
fragile,
are so heavily
paralyzed by
constrained by
fear
the
when a
stigma
safety net
and these
actually
new
does
regulations,
exist, what
money
happens
is
to the global
rapidly
economy when the
migrating out of the
majority of our
traditional
money is
banking
held
system
in digital,
altogether.
unregulated
It is
institutions
moving into the
that
world
don't
of
even
shadow
have an
banks,
umbrella
private
to
credit
ignore in the
funds,
first
hedge
place?
funds,
This is scary thought.
it's something to
Massive
think
fintech
about the next time you see
platforms.
the economic
These
storm
non-bank
clouds
financial
gathering.
intermediaries
Thanks for joining
are
us
growing
on
at
this
a
deep dive.
staggering rate.
And crucially, they engage in the exact same kind of maturity transformation and risk-taking that traditional banks do, taking short-term cash and tying it up in long-term investments.
But here's the terrifying part. These shadow banks have absolutely no access to the Fed's safety nets. None.
None at all.
They don't have a discount window to fall back on, with or without stigma. So if the highly regulated global banking system is this fragile, this paralyzed by fear when a safety net actually does exist, what happens to the global economy when the majority of our money is held in digital, unregulated institutions that don't even have an umbrella to ignore in the first place?
This is scary thought.
It's something to think about the next time you see the economic storm clouds gathering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.